Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 123 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in this week's episode, we're going to continue to discuss our journey on the human Hovell Track. Many of you may be aware by now that what started out as a 19-day through hike finished after day 14 due to injury. In this episode, we're going to discuss our last few days on the track, our reasons for getting off the track, some logistical issues or considerations if you're looking at doing this hike, as well as what our plans for the future are to finish this trip off. We hope you enjoy. Good morning. It's day 12. We're here at Junction Campground. We've just packed up and getting ready to head on to Manus Lake. Last night was not as cold as the night before, but we still had ice we needed to shake off the fly. And so while it didn't get down to what I thought was about -5 the night before, I think it probably was down to at least -1 or 2 last night. We're in a reasonably sheltered sort of campsite. So it wasn't too bad overall, but I think having the stream nearby just puts a bit of moisture into the air and makes things feel so much colder. I can see up over into the next area, there's actually a bit of frost on the ground, but where we are is reasonably clear.
Yeah, it was quite mild when we were pitching the tent and having dinner and getting ready to go to bed, and then it definitely hit in the middle of the night. So, survivable. It's okay. Tent's doing okay. For our 3-season tent is surviving 4 seasons. So yeah, all going well.
So today we're heading to Manus Lake, and depending on what time we get there and what we're feeling like and whether there's availability, we might actually avail ourselves of the bed and breakfast, which is only about 400 or 500 metres away from where the campsite is. So
but too much of a temptation, I think.
It is too much of a temptation. We also will need to pick up our food cache, which we've hidden in the general vicinity. So hopefully that's still there and still in one piece. Otherwise, it might be we do have some spares, but it might be a bit of a struggle to get through the next 8 days or 7.5 days without any extra food.
Yeah, so we've got a combination of 22 kilometres today, going via the Henry Angel trackhead, and it's a mix of easy and moderate. Okay,
we'll press on. Good evening. It's around about 6:30. This morning we started the day off at Junction Campsite, and we finished it at Manus Lake Campsite for a total of 22 kilometre distance. Not an overly difficult day, but a long day, and there was a lot of ups, although the ups weren't as bad as some of the ones we've had previously. So I think it was classed as moderate overall. From the map's perspective?
Yeah, it was. It was highlighted as a hard, long climb. It probably was that in places. And we got through it reasonably quickly. It was a really nice hike today, though. We saw all sorts of different things. My favourite thing, the echidna, was busily doing its thing, and then noticed me and stopped frozen, and then noticed Tim and moved 6 inches to the right and hit his head in the ground and thought, if he can't see us, we can't see him.
I think echidnas permanently have a look on their face that says, "Oh crap, I've been seen," and they don't walk very fast or move very fast, so they just find a bit of soft soil to bury themselves in.
Oh, partly,
partly bury themselves in, but just leaving the spines exposed and covering up the soft fleshy bits. So yeah, they're pretty impervious to anyone that isn't trying to kill them with a sharp stick or a gun. So
Yeah, look, pretty impressive. The colouring and the spines was more frightened rather than aggressive. So we didn't get too close, and we watched from a distance. The other thing that we saw today, which was just glorious, were a couple of different types of native hooded ground orchids. And you can see some of the photos of these when we do the posts. But, been hiking for a long time. Orchids are a bit of a thing that we have, terrestrial orchids, ground orchids in particular, and haven't seen that many at all. And on this hike, once we got our eye in, we were seeing dozens in clumps, and that was just amazing.
Yeah, it's both Jill and I are a horticulturalist and Jill's a botanist, and as much as we've seen these things previously, coming across them in the wild because they're so tiny, we found one patch was over 25, another one which was close, and then lots of little twos and threes here and there once we'd actually got our eye in. So we actually got to the Henry Angel trailhead site within a couple of hours of leaving this morning, and that was actually quite an impressive sight. They mow it, they maintain it really well, and yet again I seemed to find a pair of welcome swallows that had nested inside the men's toilets and were most upset that I was in there and were sweeping me, whereas Jill said no, nothing in her side at all. So it just must be me. I must encourage these things. Really, there was only one other couple there, and they were going for a walk along the trail ahead of us. But given the fact that it's Wednesday today, the park was pretty empty. But I expect it gets a lot of use over the weekend, and it's a really nice looking site if you happen to be passing through and want somewhere to camp or have a caravan with you.
Yeah, and it seems to be free, and you can stay for a number of days and.
Up to 5 days, so you're not allowed to live there, but maximum of 5 days.
Yeah, and I have to say that both Tim and I are really impressed with some of these trackheads that we've seen. They're great for the caravanner, camper trailer, as well as tent camper. So it's all out there. Go and explore.
Okay, that's us. Good night. So now we get on to day 13, and day 13 sees us starting at Manus Lake and finishing the day at Mundaroo campsite. We left Manus Lake relatively early in the morning, and for us that was probably around about 7:15, and partly that was because of the cold weather. And it wasn't particularly cold temperature-wise, but camping by such a large body of water, just the amount of moisture in the air being next to a lake just made it feel so cold.
Yeah, and I think we got into a bit of a trend of, if it wasn't a bright sunny day and there wasn't somewhere that we could sort of dry out the tent, we would just pack everything up and move on, and we would dry out things later in the day rather than wait around and wait. So it was one of those mornings. It was a pretty heavy mist, a heavy fog, and we just got up and got moving, I guess.
For a lot of today's walk, it was pretty much 80% and 85% was all on Management Road. So we walked out of the campsite on the Manus Lake Road. We then had a short section along what is the highway there for probably around about 90 metres before getting back onto Management Road again, walking through pine plantation. And in this case here, there were actually logging activities going ahead.
That was interesting.
Yeah, which did actually delay us. So we actually had to stop for about 15, 20 minutes as a logging vehicle came down the hill and with a big grappling arm picked all the large trees out of its basket at the back and just stacked them on the side of the road.
Yeah, that was a really interesting one because there were lots of signs that said do not enter and authorised personnel, and here we were on foot in the middle of a state forest where there had been some active logging, and to be honest, I thought someone would come along and stop us, and we saw, a couple of cars, but they tended to drive past, and this fellow in his big truck moving logs about and so on, and nobody seemed to be too fussed about us.
There were a couple of roads that actually said do not enter, so they obviously couldn't block the entire area off because it was an access road still. But there were side roads were blocked off, and we did have to pay very close attention to where the vehicle was, because I'm sure the driver was probably aware we were there, but it wasn't up to him to pay attention to what we were doing. It was more the other way around. So we continued on from there. Nothing overly steep on this day.
Except there was a steep descent.
Except for a steep descent. So in this case here, we were coming down from high altitude, and that's a relative term, I suppose, in this area. But we spent a lot of the day coming down, and it was nothing overly difficult, but again, it was just a continual steepness going down.
I did have a moment at one point where I thought, I'm sure they're just getting us to weave in and out of this state forest to make up the time, because we were so close in the end. We were actually so close to the campsite, relatively most of the day, that if we'd gone straight there, probably would have been 10 o'clock or something.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of these sort of things that, as the crow flies, we were probably within about 8 to 10 kilometres of where we were camping from one day to the next, but getting there involved us weaving through valleys, going up over hills and coming back down again. So we arrived at Mundaroo campsite probably around about 3:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah, about 3:30 in the afternoon. It was, I think we described Mundaroo as an unloved campsite. Had the potential to be quite nice and quite pleasant, but, a little bit overgrown and possibly not well frequented, and, the usual things that you needed. A little bit of a challenge getting to the water. There was a small swamp and a lot of blackberry, but managed to get the tent up and even get it dry in probably almost record time. That little tent's done pretty well in the weather that we had, and I think that's when we started to talk about, okay, well, what's next? The walk in wasn't a particularly difficult walk, but it was about 17 kilometres, but it did take us a long time.
As Jill said, the campsite was a bit unloved. It was probably one of the warmer campsites we'd had for a while because we weren't camped next to a large body of water. We discovered, looking on the maps, that we are actually not too far away from Manus Correctional Centre, as opposed to Manus Island. But there is actually a Manus Correctional Centre a few kilometres away, and a lot of logging trucks. So that's probably the main industry within that area. This is probably one of the more remote campsites, I think. The previous day, we were probably within 7 kilometres of Tumbarumba, and on a number of nights, we weren't a huge distance away from civilization. But in this case, there was no town that was really that close as far as walking out or driving out was concerned.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so this is where the hike changes. One thing that you may have been aware from reading the posts and from listening to our podcast over the previous couple of podcasts is that I had certainly been having a bit of a hard time of it, and I placed it down to my lack of fitness. Many of you would have been aware that I was around about 7 kilograms heavier than my through hike that I did last year. And even then, I was probably about 5 kilos up from my ideal hiking weight. I know from experience that 93 kilos is an ideal weight for me to start a hike, and I just find it relatively easy when I am that sort of weight. And this year I was about 105, just over 105 kilos. My fitness probably wasn't the worst it's been, but it certainly wasn't as good as I would have liked it. So I put my struggle down to a lack of fitness and being overweight. But one issue that I had been having, which I really hadn't thought about what it was or why it was happening, was knee injuries. I am not a fan of going downhill on hikes. Uphill I generally cope with, but downhill I find that I have real issue with compression on my knees, and my knees actually hurt. And I was finding, because of the steep hills, particularly in the distance that we actually travelled on this trip, I was having big problems with my knees. And particularly over the whole trip, to a lesser or greater extent, I was having issues. But certainly in the previous 4 or 5 days, I was finding that the first couple of hours in the morning, I could quite comfortably travel at around about 4.5 kilometres per hour, or the equivalent depending on what the terrain was. And then as I got after that, my knees would become so painful that my average hiking speed would drop down to about 2 kilometres per hour. So on some days where we were having really long days, it was due to the train, no doubt about that, but it was also due to my knee issues more than anything else.
And I think that's, I guess, an interesting point to make, that while some people might think, oh, well, the distances that we travelled and the time that we did it in and so on wasn't too bad, the experience itself was very different to what our normal experience is. And I think there are lots of indicators here that say, hey, something's not quite right. And, when you get in a bit of a rhythm and you have occasions where that rhythm isn't there, that's an indicator that something's not working.
So I had been thinking for a few days before this how I was going to manage the knee issue, what I was going to go through and do. And by this stage, when we reached Mundaroo campsite, we'd done approximately 310 kilometres of the 426 kilometre trip. And realistically, we had around about 6 days to go at an average of about 22 kilometres a day. But I was finding that based on my knee issues, on the final day, on that day 13, I'd actually strapped my knee. I'd rubbed my knee with Voltaren to reduce the inflammation. I'd taken ibuprofen as well, and that certainly got me through in the next couple of hours much more in a much better state. However, I was actually having that feeling of, I knew the pain was there, it was suppressed, it wasn't hurting, but I was actually sweating and feeling really sick because of the pain in the knees, and just wasn't enjoying what I was doing. So the ibuprofen and the Voltaren was actually providing a mask to the pain, but it wasn't getting rid of the effects of the pain.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the other thing for us is that there were also some tough days ahead. There was at least one section that was going to be hard as well. So, we're thinking about what was to come, what it was like at this minute, and, how hard or easy was it to navigate what we'd already navigated.
One of the choices that I had been thinking about was, okay, rather than taking 19 days, I had a few days spare up our sleeve. So do I add an extra couple of days into the trip? And based on how I was going and my experience of the trip, it just wasn't going through and worth pushing it just to say, right, I've completed a through hike. I've done it all in one go. So after a bit of soul searching, I decided that it really was time to pull the pin on the trip. And I think Jill was certainly fine. She was having no problems with the distances at all. And what surprised me was last year I'd done 1,000 kilometres, no issues whatsoever. Easter, 112 kilometres in 3 days, no issues whatsoever. My 3 biggest days that I've ever done on any hike is around about the 145 to 150 kilometres, and again, no issues. And for whatever reason, this trip really was knocking me around, and certainly my fitness level and the weight I was carrying certainly made a difference to that experience. Recently, we actually did a podcast and also an article on when is it time to call it quits on a hike. And I must admit, I'm quite happy to take my own advice on this one, that as much as I would have liked to have done this hike all in one go, it wasn't worth it because I really wasn't enjoying what I was doing. And I was more concerned about what the long-term impact on my knees were if I had have just pushed it. It may have been nothing. It may have caused much more damage to the joint structures. And I still have to go to health professionals over the next few days. I have an indication of what the problem is, and I'll talk about that in the written article, which I'll release over the next 3 to 4 days. But it's one of these sort of things there. I think it's going to be the really big days and the really long distances are going to be out for me for a number of months, and I'm going to have to stick to shorter hikes. Again, that's fine by me. I don't have an issue with that. But certainly it did surprise me because for so many years I've never had any issues whatsoever on my hikes. So it really did throw me in that respect. And it was, from my perspective, a hard decision to pull the pin. It's like, well, have I been successful in what I'm doing? And from my perspective, yes, I have. So what was a through hike has now become a section hike, and I will complete this trip off early next year after all the excessive heat from summer, after all the bushfire dangers are over. I may take it slightly slower. I may take it in, rather than doing it in 6 days, I might do it in 7, or I might do it a bit easier to finish the trip off.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, those who, when it's not going well, those who are traveling with you can tell it's not going well. And so, it did take us a little time to get into the real conversation about this. And, I could tell it, and as I said before, I could tell this wasn't how it usually goes when we're normally on a longer hike. Despite that, Tim was adamant that this is what he was like and this is kind of normal and all of that kind of stuff. But so you had to break through that a little bit to get a real conversation happening around what was really happening and what we were going to do next.
I must admit, it's one of those sort of things. Logistically, it would have been so much easier had I have pulled the pin the day before at Lake Manus. I could have very easily. It would have been roughly a 7.5 kilometre walk into Tumbarumba. I could have actually got transport into Tumbarumba quite easily. But as it was, Mundaroo was probably one of the sites on the whole track where if you're going to pull the pin at that point, it's probably one of the more difficult places to do it. It still involved a 10-kilometre walk out. And that put us onto the highway. It didn't take us into Mundaroo itself, which was another couple of kilometres. And thankfully we had phone signal to be able to contact a family member who did offer to actually come out and pick us up at the end of the night on day 13, which would have meant they'll be driving at night time. And we said, no, that's fine, because we still would have had to have walked out another 7 kilometres on that day, which I wouldn't have been happy with. So as it was, we walked out, I think it was around about 10 kilometres that day in total on the final day, on day 14.
Yeah.
Got to sit on the side of the road at the agreed location, and around about 15, 20 minutes later, our lift turned up and took us back to Canberra.
Yes, thank you to our lift.
it's good. It's good to have relatives. So what that means for us is, as we said, this has stopped being a through hike, now becoming a section hike. We've now done 310 kilometres approximately of this trip, and we still have approximately 116 kilometres left to go. And as I said, the plan is to finish that off at the end of summer in 2020, so somewhere around the March, April, sort of May period. Okay, so now let's look at the views or what we think of the trail so far. We've done a fair chunk of it. We haven't done the southern section of the trail, and certainly we'll revisit this, the written version of this trip write-up once we finish the whole trip. But from my perspective, injuries aside, unfitness aside, this is by far the most difficult trip that I've actually ever done as a hiker. As I said, last year I did the Bibbulmun Track, 1,000 kilometres. In comparison, that was an easy trip. The trails seem to be a bit softer, a lot more rain, I suppose, but this year we had a lot of up sections, a lot of very steep up sections. We had a lot of very narrow, slippery, and at times treacherous bits of trail.
You know, this is a rugged wilderness trail, and I think, you know, it's not a walk in the park. It's real serious hiking. The terrain says that. The variable weather conditions, you know, I think you could range from snow to fire depending on the time of year. Wind, I suspect, would be ever present irrespective of the season, as I would expect rain to be highly variable in terms of all of those things make it really, really difficult. All of those things mean things such as tree falls are quite common, and there was a lot of tree fall on the track, almost impossible to clear it. I mean, it's rugged wilderness, so, you know, you can't be out there doing that. We've talked about the blackberries and so on. So, you know, this is tough hiking. I think it's quite it's achievable, and if you've achieved it, you know, there's a strong sense of challenge. But, you know, this is the kind of hiking that says you've got to be prepared for almost anything.
So certainly from our perspective, you know, you go onto the website, and it's the sort of thing that, and I could be wrong here, but you look at, say, the Bibbulmun Track, there's a group of volunteers that help to maintain the track. You look at the Hyson Trail in South Australia, there's a group of volunteers that help to maintain that. With a lot of the tracks, they're either heavily funded by government because they're in national parks, or there's a large volunteer group that helps to maintain sections of the trail. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't a volunteer group that it might be in small sections, but there's not a volunteer group that maintains the entire trail with the government providing oversight.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think the challenge also is that a fair proportion of the track is on private land, and, you know, a shout out to all of those private landholders who allow people like us to wander through their properties. And some of those properties were quite variable in their maintenance of the track as well. You know, you're dependent on private individuals. So I think some of this is the nature of the track itself. It's not this ordered weaving through the bush, you know, with, you know, signage every so many kilometres or whatever. It's not that experience. It's quite a different experience, and I think you have to take it for the experience that it is. And you have to, I think, almost accommodate some of those imperfections, if you like, and be aware, like us, for injury. I think a lot of the up and down obviously impacted your knees, but injury may mean you can't continue. The weather may mean that you can't continue, or you need to pause, or whatever it might be. But it's not a done deal that you're going to get to the end of this, because of the nature of the track, and it's that ruggedness that I think is the appeal.
Now, I think listening to last podcast, we talked to Dean from Reflections Holiday Park at Burrinjuck, and he was saying that he gets roughly around about 50 through hikers a year coming through to do the walk. And that's if you choose to do that version. You could actually choose to bypass the dam section and do an alternate route past Lake Burrinjuck. That is a possibility. So it's not the sort of hike where you get hundreds or thousands of people doing this a year. Certainly many people do sections of it, but as far as a complete through hike from end to end, there is a much smaller number on this as a long distance trail than probably most of the other long distance trail, or the well-known long distance trails in Australia.
And from there are logbooks along the way, and from what we could tell from the information in the logbooks, and I am assuming that people write in them, which is a good idea, there were a lot of people doing sections rather than end to end. The few people who were saying that they were, attempting the whole lot were quite few and far between.
Now, Jill talked about the Weatherman's Trail, and I suppose people, and I'll put the full details in the written version or the written write-up of this track as we stand at the moment, and this will have to be completed once we finish the last section of the trail. But certainly, if you go through and have a look at the Human Hovell Track website, and there's a list of notifications up there, and they talk about burn-offs, so sections of the trail are closed, or they talk about heavy snow. I was very much aware that snow can and would impact on this trip, and anywhere from just being light snow through to something reasonably serious. And we did have sections where we couldn't actually see the trail because the snow was actually that heavy, and this was in September.
So thick on the ground.
Yeah. So if you choose to do this trip in, say, July or August, there's probably a fairly large likelihood that you're going to have to be very comfortable and experienced in hiking through the snow and all that implies to be able to actually complete this trip. And looking at the logbooks, really the last people that we could see at the end of last year were around about June. And then there was a gap in between where people who were doing through hikes had skipped. And it appeared that we were the first of the new season's hikers that have come through. And we knew there were a group of hikers about 3 days behind us. So the other issue, as we said, are bushfires. So realistically, the ideal seasons to do this trip are going to be September, October, and probably through till about early November. And then you're probably looking at around about mid-March, mid-April, through to mid-May, maybe towards the end of May, but you're starting to get a high risk of snow by that stage. So there's probably around about 2.5 months in springtime, and then 2.5 months in autumn that would be, which is 5 months of the year, that would be ideal weather conditions, whatever that means. So minimum chance of bushfires, minimum chance of snowfalls that are going to impact on you.
But recognising, high winds would be a constant, recognising that, changeable weather would be likely, all of those sorts of things. So it's not going to be, blue skies and, no wind or rain or anything else, but it's going to be the best it possibly can be, I think.
Now, certainly from a point of view of water availability, some sites had water tanks although we stopped at one where the guttering had been damaged. And the water tank was full, surprisingly enough, but the guttering had been damaged and needed repairing. But by the end of mid to late summer, particularly as Australia is almost in a drought at the moment, how much water would be available at that particular campsite may be an issue.
And I think that's a consideration about the distances. And I think some people are probably surprised at some of the distances that we have done. And, you know, the option is carry double water just in case, so you can stop between the various campsites. Those distances are in large part from campsite to campsite. So carry double water so you can stop, or, you know, risk going on a search for water at a particular point between campsites. So other than the private land, you can pretty much camp almost anywhere. You know, it's pretty clear along the way whether or not you're entering a section that you can or cannot camp in. So that adds to the difficulty of this trail as well. That says, you know, so if you're carrying extra water, that's extra weight. If you're going camp to camp, that's the distances. They're the big distances that you have to do in difficult terrain. You know, so I think it's a great hike. I loved that sense of walking in the footsteps. I love that connection with rural Australia and natural Australia, and it has a lot to offer, but it's a challenge.
And I must agree. I mean, you know, as much as we complain about the blackberries,
and I did, wrecked my shoes.
Yeah, we
my puffer.
Yeah, we had a bit of damage to clothing and gear through to the blackberries, but it was preferable to the gear than it was to us. But certainly from my perspective, I was overseas, living overseas with my parents at the time when the schools in Australia were discussing the Australian explorers. I wasn't that familiar with human Hovell before this trip. I certainly learned a lot, and it made me come away wanting to learn more. It was interesting. A lot of the information we read early on in the trip basically painted Hovell as this arrogant pommie who was really trying to take over the trip. But in all honesty, you know, we were reading information, interpretive information further along the trip that painted the story slightly differently. And you know, the both Hume and Hovell had specific skills that contributed to the success of this trip, and it wasn't just all the Hume that was the driving force behind this.
Yeah, and you know, there were some pretty interesting snippets that we discovered along the way. Being able to read that information from the maps in the places where you were at, you know, that had a lot of meaning. And I did say when I was talking about Thomas Boyd that he you know, made his fortune around the Tumut area, then went off to the coast. He didn't go to the coast. I got that wrong. One of our listeners corrected that.
And it was actually a listener who Thomas Boyd was their great-great-great-grandfather. So it was interesting to get some feedback from a family member of one of the expedition members.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, from my perspective, it made me want to learn more about the Hume and Hovell expedition, and certainly over the coming months I'll do a bit more reading into it to get a bit more detail, a bit more information. There are some really good sections out of the 14 days that we did, there are some really good sections, and there's no doubt about that. Walking through rural land, there were parts of New South Wales that I had never seen before. You know, I'd never really been to Tumut or Tumbarumba before. I'm sure I'd probably as a child I'd driven past there at some point, but not been interested. So I got to see parts of the country that I'd never seen before. I never would have liked to have seen before. There were some exceptionally good things that we saw. So particularly the day taking us from Mundaroo, so from Manus Lake through to Mundaroo was probably one of our best days, not because of the spectacular scenery or anything else, but we saw echidnas, we saw little native orchids that we're both interested in. There was lots of little interesting stuff that came up, and there were waterfalls. So there were some really good sections on this track. And as part of the written write-up, we'll go through and say, if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 days, this is the section to do. If you've got 5 to 10 days, this is the section to do.
Yeah. And there were some really lovely spots. And the fact that you had to walk the difficult terrain to get to them was probably the reason why they were still so lovely. They're a bit off the beaten track and secluded, and you either were going there deliberately or you were, passing through for some, strange reason on your way to somewhere else. So, I liked the mix of the days. I liked the rural and the native, and, even walking through some of those rural properties, I just decided that Australia was full of poop. So we've got horse poop and we've got cow poop and
wombat
sheep poop, dog poop, wombat poop. It was just, and sometimes coincidentally, sometimes finding the trail in the snow wasn't that bad because the animals like to use the trail too, so they poop on the trail. So you just look for a pile of poop.
Okay, so this is where we stand with this trip so far. So 310 kilometres done out of the 426 kilometre trail. And as I said, we will be finishing this off before winter 2020. And we'll go through and update the written article, which will release in a few days. As far as the written article is concerned, we'll go through and do a full range of photos and a full write-up and all our recommendations on this trip. I think this is one of these tracks that I would say here as one of the final things for this episode is some trips I'm very happy to say, well, I'll chance it. I won't worry about filtering. We did have some water sources that I won't say were questionable, but were very silty, were very mucky, and I wouldn't have wanted to drink a lot of the silt out of some of the water sources that we were actually using. So I think carrying a water filter of some sort, to get rid of the particulates out of the water in some areas, and this is probably one of these rare occasions that I'd probably actually say take some water purification tablets with you, because in a lot of cases we were using a gravity feed, and because of some of the impurities in the water, it was taking a number of hours to actually go through and filter the water. So a porous filter that traps the particulates, we probably needed a pre-filter. And again, not in all cases, but certainly there were a number of cases where that would have been a big help for us.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think the campsites were largely good. We talked about the ones that were a little bit forgotten and a little bit neglected. Some of the track heads were just amazing. Really very impressive and, worthwhile staying at in their own right. So, there were lots of good things about this track, lots of opportunity. But, the thing to remember is you're hiking in rugged country. That's pretty much it.
Okay, so that's our wrap up for the trip as it stands so far. As I said, for full information, including equipment recommendations and recommendations on where to stay and what to do, go through and read the written article on this trip. That will be up in around about 4 to 5 days towards the end of September 2019. So if you listen to this podcast as it's been released, we are still working on the written version of this, and that will take us a few days yet to complete this off. So we hope you've enjoyed following us along and listening to this trip, and hopefully you'll still be around within the next 6 to 8 months when we do finish this trip off. Thanks for listening to us. We hope you've enjoyed. Bye for now.
And bye from me.
Take some water for purification. Take some water for. Certainly from my perspective, I was around about 7 kilometres heavier than I was last year when I started my through hike.
That would be kilograms as opposed to kilometres. I don't know. I don't know how we're measuring things now, but